overzealous HOA president went from installing safety measures on my private driveway to launching a full-scale war that involved illegal surveillance, property damage, and a retired security expert who wouldn't back down. What started as a simple property dispute turned into something far more sinister than anyone could have imagined. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Marcus Reynolds didn't choose the sprawling Victorian house at 42 Oakridge Lane for its curb appeal. The three-story building, with its weather-worn shutters and wraparound porch, sat at the end of a steep, winding driveway that cut through 2 acres of dense maple forest. What caught his eye was the property's potential for privacy and security, something a man with his background valued above all else. After 20 years working as a high-level security consultant for various 3-letter agencies, Marcus knew the importance of choosing the right location. The house's elevated position offered clear sightlines in all directions. The long driveway provided a natural choke point that could be easily monitored, and the thick tree coverage made it nearly impossible for anyone to approach unseen. Within 6 months of moving in, Marcus had transformed the aging Victorian into a modern fortress disguised as a historic home. State-of-the-art security cameras were hidden behind decorative moldings. Motion sensors were concealed within antique light fixtures. The original wrought-iron gate was reinforced with military-grade steel and equipped with biometric locks. To the casual observer, it looked like nothing more than an eccentric retiree's passion project, exactly as Marcus intended. The Oakridge Heights Homeowners Association had other ideas about his renovations. Their president, Patricia Morrison, known not so affectionately by neighbors as Power Trip Patty, had made it her personal mission to maintain what she called historical authenticity in the neighborhood. Every modification, no matter how subtle, drew her attention and criticism, but Marcus had done his homework before purchasing the property. His land, including the entire driveway, fell outside the HOA's jurisdiction, a fact confirmed by 3 separate property lawyers. He had the documentation to prove it, which he kept filed away for the inevitable confrontation he knew would come. What Marcus didn't expect was how far Patricia would go to assert her authority. The woman treated her position as HOA president like a divine mandate, ruling over her domain with clipboard in hand and an arsenal of petty ordinances at her disposal. Her weekly property compliance walks were notorious, with residents scrambling to bring their grass height within regulation or risk facing her wrath. Marcus watched through his security feeds as Patricia would stop at his gate almost daily, her silver Mercedes idling while she scribbled notes and took photos with her phone. He knew she was looking for violations, anything to justify the growing stack of warning letters she kept sending him. But as long as she stayed outside his property line, he was content to let her waste her time. Then came the incident that would change everything. It was a crisp autumn morning when Marcus first spotted the construction crew at the base of his driveway. They wore unmarked uniforms and drove vehicles with no company logos, a detail that immediately set off alarm. Bells in his mind. As he watched through his cameras, they began unloading what looked like heavy metal plates from the back of their truck. Marcus grabbed his jacket and headed outside, his boots crunching on the gravel as he made his way down the driveway. But before he could reach them, a familiar silver Mercedes pulled up. Patricia stepped out, designer heels clicking against the pavement as she approached with a clipboard and a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Good morning, Mr. Reynolds," she called out, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "I'm sure you'll be pleased to know that the HOA board has unanimously approved the installation of new safety measures for our community's steeper driveways. We're starting with yours, given its concerning grade." Marcus felt his jaw tighten as he watched the crew continue unloading their equipment. He'd seen similar devices before. Retractable spike strips disguised as speed bumps. They were the kind of security measure typically reserved for government facilities and military bases, not residential driveways. "This is private property. Patricia," he said quietly, his tone carrying the weight of years of handling high-stakes confrontations. "You have no authority here." Patricia's smile widened, but her eyes turned cold. "Oh, Mr. Reynolds," she replied, consulting her clipboard, "I think you'll find that under Community Safety Ordinance 47B, we have every authority, and this is just the beginning." As Marcus stood there, watching the crew prepare to install the first spike strip, he realized this wasn't just about property rights anymore. Patricia Morrison had just declared war, and she had no idea who she was really dealing with. Marcus's background hadn't always been as clean-cut as his perfectly maintained Victorian facade suggested. Before his career in official security consulting, he'd worked in what he called the grey sector, private military contractors and corporate security firms that operated in the shadows of international conflicts. His expertise wasn't just in installing security systems, it was in penetrating them, finding weaknesses that others overlooked, and turning defense into offense when necessary. Those skills had made him both valuable and dangerous to his employers. He'd seen firsthand how corporations and bureaucracies could abuse their power, using seemingly innocent regulations and safety measures as weapons against those who stood in their way. It was why he'd chosen to retire early, buying property specifically outside HOA jurisdiction. He'd wanted a quiet life, but he'd also made sure to maintain connections with former colleagues who owed him favors, just in case. The decision to keep those connections had proved prescient. Within hours of the confrontation with Patricia, Marcus was on a secure line with his old friend at the county records office. Sarah Martinez had been helping him navigate bureaucratic mazes for 15 years, and her access to property records had saved his life more than once during operations. "The HOA's been busy, Marcus," Sarah said, her keyboard clicking rapidly in the background. "They've filed 17 new ordinances in the past month alone. Most of them are about community safety and infrastructure improvements. But here's the weird part. They're all sponsored by a company I've never heard of, Safeguard Community Solutions." Marcus frowned, making notes on his tablet. "What do you know about them?" "On paper, they're a consulting firm specializing in residential security, but—" Sarah paused, and Marcus could hear more intense typing. "Their incorporation papers were only filed 3 months ago. The registered address is a virtual office in Delaware, and their board of directors is suspiciously thin. Classic shell company setup. Who's backing them?" "That's where it gets interesting," Sarah replied. "I can't trace the money directly, but they've been making substantial campaign contributions to local officials. The same officials who oversee property zoning and water rights." Marcus's eyes narrowed. Water rights. The piece clicked into place. His property sat above one of the largest untapped aquifers in the state. He'd known about it when he bought the land, but hadn't thought much of it at the time. Now it seemed more relevant. "Send me everything you have on Safeguard and their local activities," he said. "And Sarah, watch your back on this one." After hanging up, Marcus spent the next few hours reviewing his property's security footage from the past month. Now that he knew what to look for, he spotted patterns he'd missed before. The unmarked vehicles that would drive past his gate late at night. The utility workers who seemed unnecessarily interested in his property boundaries. The drone that had buzzed his tree line twice last week, too high to trigger his motion sensors, but now clearly visible in enhanced footage. His tablet pinged with an incoming email from Sarah. The attachments confirmed his suspicions. Safeguard Community Solutions had been systematically buying up property rights and easements throughout the county, always working through local HOAs and community organizations. Their pattern was consistent: start with safety regulations, escalate to property violations, and end with forced sales or eminent domain claims. Marcus pulled up the construction crew's photos from that morning, running them through his facial recognition software. The results were telling. 2 of the workers had military backgrounds, their profiles matching private security contractors he'd encountered during his consulting days. This wasn't just an HOA flexing its authority. It was a professional operation hiding behind Patricia Morrison's bureaucratic crusade. The spike strips were just the beginning. Marcus knew their playbook. He'd helped write parts of it during his corporate security days. They would start with physical obstacles, move to surveillance, and gradually escalate until the target was forced to capitulate. But knowing their strategy gave him an advantage they hadn't counted on. Marcus spent the rest of the afternoon taking inventory of his resources. His security system was top of the line, but he'd need to upgrade the perimeter sensors to detect higher-flying drones. The cameras were well hidden, but he'd need more coverage of the surrounding forest. And most importantly, he'd need to start gathering evidence of their activities, evidence that could be used legally when the time came. As darkness fell, Marcus watched through his monitors as another unmarked vehicle pulled up to his gate. This time, 2 men in dark clothing emerged, carrying what looked like surveying equipment. But Marcus recognized the gear for what it really was: ground-penetrating radar, likely being used to map the aquifer beneath his property. He allowed himself a grim smile as he began programming new security protocols into his system. Patricia, Morrison and Safeguard thought they were dealing with a stubborn retiree who would eventually bow to pressure. They were about to learn just how wrong they were. The safety measures they'd installed that morning would be gone before sunrise, and that would just be his opening move. Marcus settled into his security room, monitors glowing in the darkness as he began planning his counter-strategy. He'd spent years protecting others from exactly this kind of corporate takeover. Now it was time to put those skills to use, protecting his own property. Patricia Morrison had no idea that her simple HOA power play was about to turn into something much more complicated. The first real test of wills came at exactly 2:17 a.m. Marcus sat in his security room, multiple monitors casting a blue glow across his face as he watched the drama unfold through his night vision cameras. The spike strips that Patricia's crew had installed were still there, gleaming dully in the infrared light, but not for much longer. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. He'd spent the evening preparing, methodically documenting everything with high-resolution cameras and thermal imaging. Each spike strip had been photographed, measured, and logged with GPS coordinates. He'd even taken soil samples from around the installation points, evidence that might prove useful later if chemicals or unauthorized materials were used during installation. The sound of approaching vehicles caught his attention. His perimeter. Sensors picked up 2 SUVs moving slowly along the main road, their headlights off. Amateur move, Marcus thought. The darkness didn't hide them from his infrared cameras, and the attempt at stealth only proved they knew they shouldn't be there. The vehicle stopped just beyond his property line, and 4 figures emerged. They moved with the practiced coordination of professional security personnel, but their attempt at stealth was almost insulting to someone of Marcus's background. He could see the bulge of concealed weapons under their jackets and their radio earpieces. Caught the moonlight as they moved. "Time to play," Marcus muttered, reaching for his keyboard. With a few keystrokes, he activated his property's defensive measures, not the obvious ones they might be expecting, but subtler preparations he'd made earlier that day. The first sign that something was wrong came when their handheld radios crackled with interference. Marcus had set up signal jammers around the property, carefully calibrated to disrupt their specific frequency band, while leaving emergency channels clear. He watched with satisfaction as the men tapped their earpieces in confusion, their formation becoming less coordinated as communication broke down. As they approached the first spike strip, Marcus pressed another key. Suddenly, their supposedly covert operation was illuminated by thousands of watts of hidden LED floodlights, strategically placed to blind anyone approaching from their angle. The men stumbled, throwing up their hands to shield their eyes. "This is private property." Marcus's pre-recorded voice boomed from concealed speakers. "You are being recorded. Leave immediately, or law enforcement will be notified." The men froze, clearly not expecting this level of security. Marcus had positioned the speakers to make his voice seem to come from multiple directions, an old psychological warfare trick he'd learned years ago. The disorientation was visible in their body language, but they didn't retreat. Instead, one of them pulled out what looked like an official document, probably some fraudulent HOA authorization, and called out, "We have legal authority to inspect and maintain community safety measures. Any interference will result in fines and possible legal action." Marcus almost admired their commitment to the cover story. Almost. He pressed another button, and hidden sprinklers emerged from the ground around them. But these weren't filled with water. The mixture of harmless but foul-smelling liquid was another remnant of his security consulting days, typically used for crowd control. The effect was immediate and satisfying. The men broke formation, scrambling away from the spray. Their attempts at professional composure disappeared as the chemical compound soaked through their clothes, its skunk-like odor causing them to gag. "Next time," Marcus's recorded voice announced pleasantly, "the police will be called immediately, and I have plenty of evidence of your trespassing. Take the spike strips with you. They're your property, after all." He watched as the men retreated to their vehicles, dignity forgotten in their rush to escape the stench. They didn't even try to maintain their cover story about inspecting the spike strips. Within minutes, they were gone, leaving only tire tracks and the lingering smell of his special deterrent. Marcus leaned back in his chair, allowing himself a small smile. This had been a test, both sides testing the other's capabilities and resolve. Safeguard and Patricia had expected to intimidate a retiree with their show of force. Instead, they'd learned that their target was far better prepared than they'd anticipated, but Marcus knew this was just the beginning. They would be back, better prepared and with new tactics. The spike strips had been their opening move, a way to establish presence and assert authority. His counter had shown them that simple intimidation wouldn't work, which meant they would have to escalate. He spent the next hour downloading and backing up all the footage from multiple secure servers. The chemical spray was technically legal, a patented formula marketed for agricultural pest control, and his warning systems were well within his rights as a property owner. But he knew Safeguard's next move would likely involve trying to use this incident against him, twisting it into some violation of HOA regulations. As the adrenaline of the confrontation wore off, Marcus began composing an email to Sarah. She needed to know about tonight's events, and he needed her to start digging deeper into Safeguard's local operations. Something about their persistence, their professional backing, suggested this was about more than just water rights. There were pieces of the puzzle still missing, and Marcus had learned long ago that in situations like this, missing information could be deadly. The next morning, Marcus found not one, but 3 envelopes attached to his gate. Each bore the Oakridge Heights HOA letterhead, but the paper quality and professional printing told him these weren't Patricia's usual violation notices. These came from higher up. Inside the first envelope was a formal complaint about dangerous and unauthorized security measures. The second contained an invoice for $25,000 in damages to community safety equipment. Apparently, they were billing him for their own spike strips. But it was the third envelope that caught his attention. Inside was a single page of heavy cardstock bearing the Safeguard Community Solutions logo alongside the HOA's emblem. "Dear Mr. Reynolds," the letter began, "as the contracted security consultants for Oakridge Heights, we must formally notify you of multiple violations of Community Safety Ordinance 47B, 48C, and 51A. Your recent actions, including the deployment of chemical agents and unauthorized surveillance equipment, represent a clear and present danger to community welfare." The letter went on to detail a list of fines totaling over $150,000, with an additional $10,000 being added daily until he remedied these violations. At the bottom was Patricia Morrison's signature, alongside that of someone named Alexander. "Blackwood, Chief Security Officer of Safeguard Community Solutions." Marcus photographed each document carefully before bringing them inside. The name Alexander Blackwood tickled something in his memory. He pulled up his encrypted database of former military and security contacts, a resource he'd maintained meticulously over the years. It took several minutes of searching before he found what he was looking for. "Well, well," he muttered, studying the file. Alexander Blackwood had been a rising star in private military contracting about a decade ago, specializing in resource acquisition and security. His company had been hired by several multinational corporations to handle property disputes in regions rich in natural resources. The methods had been questionable enough that even Marcus, with his flexible moral code, had declined to work with him. A quick search revealed more. Blackwood's previous company had been dissolved following a series of lawsuits involving illegal surveillance, property theft, and allegations of intimidation. But the cases had been settled out of court, the records sealed, and Blackwood had seemingly disappeared, until now. Marcus's tablet pinged with an incoming message from Sarah. "You need to see this," her text read, followed by several attachments. The files revealed a pattern of similar situations across 3 different states. Small HOAs suddenly implementing aggressive security measures, followed by property disputes, and finally, forced sales. In each case, Safeguard Community Solutions had been involved, though under slightly different names. But what caught Marcus's eye was the timing. Each operation had coincided with major construction projects: reservoirs, water treatment facilities, pipeline installations. The HOAs were just a cover, a way to legally access and control strategic properties. His phone rang, a secure line he gave to only a handful of people. "Marcus," Sarah's voice was tense, "there's something else. The county just approved plans for a new water processing facility, but they're keeping the location classified for now. The only public detail is that it's somewhere in your area." "Let me guess," Marcus replied. "Safeguard Community Solutions is listed as a security consultant on the project?" "Better. They're part owners through a subsidiary." "Marcus, these people, they don't just want your property. They want the entire aquifer, and they're using the HOA to clear the way." Marcus walked to his window, looking out over his property. From this angle, he could see 3 other houses that backed up to the forest, all sitting above the same aquifer. He'd bet anything their owners had received similar letters this morning. "Sarah, I need you to do something for me. Find out who owns those other properties and see if you can get me their contact information. It's time to let my neighbors know what they're really up against, already on it. But Marcus, be careful. I've been digging into Blackwood's history. The sealed court records. They didn't just involve property disputes. 3 homeowners who fought back disappeared. The cases were ruled suicides, but I understand," Marcus said quietly. "Keep digging, but watch your back. And Sarah, thank you. After hanging up, Marcus sat down at his security console and began typing. The HOA and Safeguard thought they could pressure him with fines and legal threats. That was fine. He'd play their game for now, but he'd also start preparing for when they inevitably dropped the pretense of legality. He pulled up the chemical formula for the spray he'd used last night, already planning modifications. If Blackwood was involved, the next intrusion would involve better-trained personnel, probably with protective gear. He'd need something more sophisticated than bad odors to defend his property. As he worked, Marcus glanced at his monitors. Patricia's silver Mercedes was parked at the end of his driveway again, but this time she wasn't alone. A black SUV with tinted windows had pulled up beside her, and she appeared to be having an intense conversation with someone inside. Marcus zoomed in his camera, capturing clear images of the exchange. Something told him he'd want to know who she was meeting with. The spike strips returned 3 days later, but this time they were different. Marcus studied them through his high-powered binoculars from his second-floor observation point. These weren't the amateur devices from before. These were military-grade vehicle restraint systems, the kind used at secure government facilities. Each strip was anchored into the concrete with hardened steel bolts, and the spikes themselves were made of tungsten carbide. "Getting serious, aren't you, Blackwood?" Marcus muttered, noting how the strips had been strategically placed at the steepest points of his driveway. They weren't just trying to control access anymore. They were creating choke points, forcing him to slow down at precisely the spots where his vehicle would be most vulnerable. The installation team was different too. Gone were the unmarked uniforms and casual demeanor. These men moved with military precision, and their construction vehicle was a poorly disguised tactical operations truck. Marcus recognized the subtle signs: reinforced suspension, run flat, tires, and the slight bulge in the side panels that suggested armored plating. He spent the morning documenting everything with high-resolution video and thermal imaging. The new spike strips contained electronics, temperature sensors, pressure, plates, and what looked like cellular transmitters. They weren't just barriers, they were surveillance devices. Time to make some calls, Marcus decided. He had contacts in the county engineering department who owed him favors from his consulting days. Within an hour, he'd confirmed his suspicions. No permits had been filed for the installation of traffic control devices on his property. More importantly, the type of restraint system they'd installed was restricted. Civilian contractors couldn't legally possess them. Marcus began composing an email to his lawyer, attaching photos and specifications. But before he could send it, his perimeter sensors triggered. A familiar silver Mercedes was approaching his gate, but this time Patricia Morrison wasn't alone. A tall man in an expensive suit stepped out of the passenger side, his bearing immediately marking him as military or former military. Marcus switched on his external microphones, focusing them on the pair. "Mr. Reynolds," Patricia called out, her voice carrying that same artificial sweetness. "I'd like you to meet Mr. Blackwood from Safeguard. We need to discuss the new safety measures and your concerning response to our previous installation." Marcus watched through his cameras as Blackwood studied his gait, his eyes methodically tracking the security features. The man was good. He'd already spotted 3 of the visible cameras, but Marcus knew he'd missed the others. "I'll pass," Marcus replied through the intercom. "But since you're here, you should know that I've documented the illegal installation of restricted military hardware on private property. I'm sure the FBI would be very interested in how Safeguard acquired those particular models of vehicle restraints." Blackwood's expression didn't change, but his posture shifted slightly, a fighter's stance that Marcus recognized all too well. "Mr. Reynolds," Blackwood's voice was smooth, professional. "I think there's been a misunderstanding. These are standard safety devices, fully approved by the HOA board. As for their specifications, well, Safeguard maintains contracts with various government agencies. Everything is quite legal, I assure you. Like your contracts in South America were legal? Marcus watched with satisfaction as Blackwood's calm facade cracked slightly. Or maybe we should discuss the 3 homeowners who committed suicide after opposing your previous company's activities. Patricia's head snapped toward Blackwood, genuine surprise crossing her face. Interesting, Marcus thought. She didn't know about her partner's history. I'm not sure what you think you know, Blackwood replied, his voice harder now, but I suggest you focus on complying with HOA regulations. These safety measures stay in place. Any interference will result in immediate legal action. Legal action? Marcus laughed. Go ahead. I'm sure the media would love to hear about an HOA installing military-grade vehicle restraints on private property, especially once they learn about Safeguard's interesting history of acquiring land through, let's call it, aggressive means. Blackwood stepped closer to the gate, speaking quietly now. You're playing a dangerous game, Mr. Reynolds. Smart men know when to cooperate, and smart men know when they're being threatened, Marcus responded. Here's what's going to happen. You have 24 hours to remove those devices from my property. After that, I'll remove them myself and release everything I have about Safeguard to every news outlet and federal agency I can think of. Patricia started to speak, but Blackwood silenced her with a gesture. His eyes scanned the gate more time before he smiled, a cold, professional expression that didn't reach his eyes. 24 hours, we'll see. Have a good day, Mr. Reynolds. As they drove away, Marcus watched Patricia gesturing animatedly in her car, clearly demanding explanations from Blackwood. The encounter had confirmed his suspicions. Patricia was just a pawn, probably unaware of Safeguard's true nature or intentions. Blackwood was the real threat. Marcus turned back to his security console, fingers flying over the keyboard as he began implementing new protocols. Blackwood wouldn't wait 24 hours. He'd make a move tonight, trying to catch Marcus off guard. But this time, Marcus would be ready with more than just stink bombs and lights. The legal assault came swifter and harder than Marcus had anticipated. By sunset, his inbox was flooded with official notices, each more threatening than the last. The HOA had convened an emergency board meeting, one he conveniently hadn't been notified about, and passed a series of new ordinances specifically, targeting non-compliant security measures and unauthorized defensive installations. The final email, bearing both the HOA and Safeguard letterheads, detailed accumulated fines now totaling over $475,000. More alarmingly, it included a notice of intent to place a lien on his property if the fines weren't paid within 72 hours. They were trying to financially strangle him into submission. Nice try, Marcus muttered, forwarding the emails to his lawyer. He'd prepared for this, maintaining a separate legal defense fund specifically for property disputes. But the speed and coordination of their attack concerned him. They were moving faster than typical corporate bureaucracy allowed, which meant they had judges or local officials in their pocket. His secure phone buzzed. Sarah again. Marcus, we've got problems. Remember those building permits I was tracking? They just got fast-tracked through the county system. Whatever Safeguard's planning, they're accelerating their timeline. They're getting nervous, Marcus replied, scanning through his security feeds. Blackwood knows I've got dirt on him. He can't afford a drawn-out legal battle that might expose Safeguard's operations. It's worse than that. Sarah's voice dropped. Lower. I found something in the sealed court records from Blackwood's previous company. Those 3 suicides. They all happened right after the victims filed appeals against property liens, the exact same kind of liens Safeguard's trying to put on your place. Marcus moved to his window, scanning the tree line out of habit. They use the liens to force a quick sale, then make the owners disappear before they can challenge it in court. Exactly. But here's the thing. I tracked the property transfers. In each case, the land was sold to shell companies within hours of the owners' deaths. The paperwork was already prepared, just waiting for signatures. Let me guess, the shell companies all traced back to water management corporations? Bingo! Marcus, they're not just after the aquifer, they're trying to control the entire region's water supply. Your property is just one piece of a bigger land grab. Marcus was about to respond when movement on his monitors caught his eye. A small drone was hovering just beyond his property line, its camera clearly focused on his house. Unlike the previous surveillance attempts, this one wasn't trying to hide. "Sarah, I need to go. Get me everything you can on Safeguard's other properties in the area. And Sarah, watch your back. These people play for keeps." After hanging up, Marcus pulled up his property's defensive grid. The drone was military grade, equipped with thermal imaging and probably signals intelligence gear. It was a deliberate show of force. Blackwood, letting him know he was being watched. Marcus's tablet chimed with another email notification. This one wasn't from the HOA or Safeguard. It was from his nearest neighbor, David Chen, whose property also sat above the aquifer. The message was brief but alarming. "Mr. Reynolds, just received notice of eminent domain proceedings against my property. HOA claims my land is needed for critical infrastructure development. Meeting with their lawyers tomorrow. Any advice would be appreciated." Marcus quickly typed out a response, warning Chen not to meet with anyone alone and to document everything, but he knew it might already be too late. If Safeguard was moving to eminent domain, they had local government officials completely under their control. His security system pinged again. Patricia's Mercedes was back, but this time she wasn't stopping at the gate. She pulled over near his property line and began methodically photographing his house and driveway. Even from this distance, Marcus could see her hands shaking slightly as she documented each violation. Something in her manner caught his attention. The usual smug confidence was gone, replaced by what looked like genuine fear. Marcus zoomed in his cameras, studying her expression. Patricia wasn't just documenting violations. She was looking over her shoulder every few seconds, as if expecting someone to be watching her too. "You're in too deep, aren't you, Patricia?" Marcus murmured, watching as she hurriedly finished her photography and practically jumped back into her car. She wasn't just Blackwood's willing accomplice anymore. She was another pawn in his game, probably realizing too late what she'd gotten herself into. Marcus spent the next hour drafting emails to every property owner in the neighborhood, warning them about the impending land grab and providing evidence of Safeguard's true intentions. He knew most would probably dismiss it as conspiracy theories, but if even a few started asking questions, it might slow Blackwood's plans. But as he worked, a notification from his perimeter sensors indicated more vehicles approaching. Black SUVs with tinted windows, Safeguard's trademark. They weren't even pretending to be contractors anymore. The real pressure was about to begin. That night, Marcus prepared for a stakeout, but not from his usual observation post. He'd noticed Safeguard surveillance patterns focusing on his house and security room. They were expecting him to monitor from there, which was exactly why. He'd set up a secondary command center in an underground storm shelter, accessible through a concealed entrance in his garage. The shelter dated back to the Cold War, but Marcus had modernized it with state-of-the-art equipment. Multiple monitors displayed feeds from his property's cameras, while others showed thermal imaging of the surrounding forest. A dedicated satellite uplink provided secure internet access, completely separate from his house's network. At exactly midnight, his patience was rewarded. The drone returned, but this time it wasn't alone. 3 more joined it, creating a surveillance grid over his property. They were flying in a precise pattern, likely mapping every inch of his land with ground-penetrating radar and thermal imaging. "Looking for my blind spots," Marcus muttered, watching the drone's flight paths. He noticed they were paying particular attention to the areas where his security cameras were visible. They thought they were mapping his surveillance system, but they were actually following the trail of breadcrumbs he'd left for them. Through his thermal cameras, Marcus spotted movement in the tree line. 6 heat signatures were moving in pairs, using professional tactical formation. They were good, using the trees for cover, staying in the shadows, and maintaining proper spacing. But their careful approach told Marcus something crucial. They were afraid of his property's defenses. The intruders reached his first perimeter line, and Marcus watched as they meticulously swept for traps or sensors. They found the obvious ones, simple motion detectors and tripwires, and carefully disabled them. Their confidence seemed to grow as they encountered only basic security measures. "That's it," Marcus whispered. "Get comfortable, get sloppy." The team advanced further, now approaching his second security layer. This was where things would get interesting. One of the men pulled out what looked like an electronic scanning device, probably checking for more sophisticated surveillance equipment. Marcus allowed himself a small smile as he watched the scanner's lights blink green. Of course it detected nothing, because his real security system used technology that commercial scanners couldn't detect, originally developed for covert military operations. The intruders had reached the edge of his driveway when Marcus activated his first countermeasure. Suddenly, their radio communications filled with static, but not random noise. Hidden transmitters began broadcasting on their frequency, playing back recorded fragments of their own communications from the past hour. The effect was immediate. The team froze, clearly confused by hearing their own voices coming through their earpieces. Their formation tightened as they tried to figure out how their secure channel had been compromised. Marcus watched their heat signatures bunch together. Exactly what he'd been waiting for. With a few keystrokes, he activated the ground-based sensors he'd installed beneath the driveway. These weren't simple motion detectors. They were sophisticated seismic sensors that could map the exact position of anyone standing on his property. The data from the sensors fed into his targeting system, giving him precise coordinates for each intruder. Marcus didn't plan to harm them. That would play right into Safeguard's hands. Instead, he'd give them something to think about. With surgical precision, Marcus activated his newly installed defense system. Highly focused sound waves, completely silent to the human ear, began hitting the intruders at specific frequencies designed to cause extreme discomfort without any physical damage. It was technology originally developed for crowd control, but Marcus had modified it for precision targeting. The effect was dramatic. The professional formation dissolved as the men clutched their heads, their equilibrium suddenly destroyed by the invisible attack. Through his thermal imaging, Marcus could see them staggering, trying to maintain their balance as the sound waves disrupted their inner ear function. "Command, we're being hit with something," one of them gasped into his radio, his voice playing back through Marcus's speakers. "Some kind of can't stand up, need to abort." The drones above tried to maintain their pattern, but without ground team coordination, their careful mapping was useless. Marcus watched as the intruders retreated, several of them literally crawling back to the tree line as the sound waves continued their invisible assault. Once they were clear of his property, Marcus deactivated the system. He knew they'd be back, probably with equipment to counter this defense. But tonight's demonstration had served its purpose. They now knew that his security capabilities far exceeded their expectations. As the last heat signature disappeared into the forest, Marcus began downloading the night's surveillance data. Every second had been recorded from multiple angles, providing clear evidence of their attempted infiltration. But more importantly, he'd captured their radio communications, including several mentions of Operation Watershed, a detail Sarah would definitely want to investigate. The drones maintained their position for another hour before finally retreating. Marcus used this time to send encrypted updates to both his lawyer and Sarah. Safeguard had just proven they were willing to resort to physical intimidation. The question now was, how would they react when they realized their strike team had been defeated by a security system they couldn't even detect? The discovery came at dawn. As the first rays of sunlight crept over the horizon, Marcus's thermal cameras picked up an unusual heat signature beneath one of the spike strips. He switched to high-resolution visual feeds, zooming in on the area. There, barely visible among the sophisticated vehicle restraints, was something new. A small, black box with a faint blue LED. Active RFID tracking system, Marcus muttered, recognizing the technology. But this wasn't standard surveillance equipment. The device's housing had a distinctive pattern he'd seen only once before, during a classified defense contract job in Dubai. It was cutting-edge tech, designed to map not just movement patterns, but to create detailed 3D models of any structure it monitored. Marcus pulled up the specifications on his secure tablet. The system, officially designated as XR7 by its manufacturer, could penetrate walls and map internal layouts with millimeter precision. More concerning, it could track heat signatures through multiple layers of concrete and steel. His underground command center wouldn't stay secret for long with that thing operating, but the presence of military-grade surveillance equipment on civilian property created an opportunity. Marcus placed a call to an old contact at the Defense Technology Security Administration. "Mike, it's Marcus Reynolds. Remember that favor you owe me from the Singapore operation? I'm calling it in. I need you to verify something for me." He transmitted photos of the device to a secure server. "I've got restricted hardware showing up on civilian property. XR7 mapping system, latest generation. Someone's playing with toys. They shouldn't have." Mike's response was immediate and profane. "Where the hell did you find that? Those units are strictly controlled. Even our domestic agencies need presidential authorization to deploy them. Would you be interested in knowing that a private security company called Safeguard Community Solutions is using them for residential surveillance?" There was a long pause. "Send me everything you have. Serial numbers, installation dates, any documentation." This just became a federal matter. As Marcus transmitted the data, his perimeter sensors alerted him to movement at the gate. Patricia Morrison had arrived for her morning harassment session, but something was different. Instead of her usual aggressive stance, she was nervously glancing over her shoulder. When she reached for the intercom, her hand was shaking. "Mr. Reynolds?" Her voice had lost its condescending edge. I need to talk to you. It's important. Please." Marcus studied her body language through his cameras. The fear was genuine, but this could still be a trap. He activated his external speakers. "Whatever you have to say, you can say it there." Patricia glanced around again before stepping closer to the intercom. "It's about Safeguard. Last night, after the incident with their team, Blackwood called an emergency meeting. They're not just after your property anymore. They're planning something bigger, something worse." "Why are you telling me this?" "Because they threatened my family." Patricia's composure cracked slightly. "When I questioned their methods, Blackwood showed me pictures of my daughter at college in Boston. Said accidents can happen anywhere. Mr. Reynolds, I never wanted... I didn't know what they really were." Marcus zoomed in his cameras. Patricia was holding something in her left hand, a thick manila envelope. "What's in the envelope?" "Documents, financial records, emails, meeting minutes, everything I could download from the HOA's servers about Safeguard and Operation Watershed. I'm not a good person, Mr. Reynolds. I've abused my position, harassed people, enjoyed the power. But I never signed up for this." Marcus considered his options. Patricia's intel could be valuable, but trusting her was risky. Then again, Blackwood threatening her family fit his profile. He'd done the same thing in South America, turning reluctant local officials into unwilling accomplices. "Leave the envelope in the gate," Marcus instructed. "Then drive straight to your daughter in Boston. Don't go home, don't pack, and don't use your credit cards. They're monitoring those." Patricia quickly stuffed the envelope between the gate's bars. "They'll know I gave this to you." "They already know. That's why you need to leave now. There's a gas station 3 towns over on Route 16. Pay cash for a burner phone and call your daughter. Tell her to get somewhere safe." As Patricia hurried back to her car, Marcus noticed movement in his thermal feeds. 2 SUVs were parked just around the corner, their engines still hot. Safeguard had been watching the entire exchange. Marcus quickly accessed his gate's camera, photographing the envelope before retrieving it via a mechanical arm he'd installed for collecting mail. As soon as the envelope was secure, he activated his property's active defenses. If Safeguard wanted to move against him now, they'd have to fight their way through multiple layers of security. Inside the envelope, Marcus found exactly what Patricia had promised: internal documents detailing Safeguard's operation, but mixed in with the expected financial records was something unexpected: geological surveys of the entire region, focusing on not just the aquifer, but on something much deeper. The geological surveys painted a picture far more complex than a simple water rights grab. Marcus spread the documents across his workbench, connecting patterns that Patricia probably hadn't even noticed. The aquifer was just the surface layer, quite literally. Beneath it lay something that made the water rights look like a sideshow: rare earth elements, concentrated in deposits that satellite imaging suggested were worth billions. "Son of a bitch," Marcus muttered, understanding dawning. The water facility was never the end game. He pulled up his secure communication line to Sarah, but before he could connect, his surveillance system pinged an urgent alert. Multiple vehicles approaching from different directions, moving in coordinated patterns. Switching to his external cameras, Marcus counted at least 6 black SUVs, plus 2 larger tactical vehicles. This wasn't another probing attack. This was a full assault team. They'd obviously been waiting for Patricia to make her move, and now they were done playing games. His phone rang, Sarah's emergency line. "Marcus, Blackwood's people just hit the county records office. They're destroying files, wiping servers. Whatever was in those documents Patricia gave you, they're trying to erase all traces of it." "The rare earth deposits," Marcus said, quickly scanning the most crucial documents. "Safeguard's real client isn't a water management company. It's a mining consortium. They're using the water rights as cover for a massive mining operation." "That explains the shell companies," Sarah replied. "But Marcus, there's something else. I managed to pull some files before they wiped the servers. Those deposits, they're dangerously radioactive. Any mining operation would contaminate the groundwater for the entire region." Marcus's jaw tightened as the pieces fell into place. "They're not just trying to buy the land, they're trying to empty it. The water facility, the property liens, the HOA pressure. They need everyone gone before the contamination becomes public knowledge." His security system blared another warning. The assault team had reached his outer perimeter, and they weren't bothering with subtlety this time. Armored figures were deploying in standard military formation, carrying equipment that made their previous incursions look amateur. "Sarah, I need to go. Get those files to Mike at the DTSA, and then get somewhere safe. This is about to get ugly." Marcus switched his system to combat protocols, activating every defensive measure he'd installed. But as he watched the team advance, he noticed something different about their equipment. They were carrying signal jammers and electromagnetic pulse generators specifically designed to counter his security systems. "Learning from your mistakes, Blackwood?" Marcus muttered, noting how they methodically disabled his outdoor cameras and sensors. But he'd anticipated this. His critical systems were hardened against EMP, and his backup cameras used closed-circuit connections that couldn't be jammed. Through these backup feeds, Marcus watched as the team split into 3 groups. 2 would likely create diversions, while the third attempted to breach his defenses, standard tactical doctrine, except they didn't know about his underground command center or his military-grade countermeasures. The first group reached the spike strips, but instead of avoiding them, they began attaching something to the bases. Marcus zoomed in, recognizing shaped charges designed to turn the strips into shrapnel. They were planning to use his own defenses against him. The second team was moving through his blind spots, or what they thought were blind spots. In reality, they were following exactly the path Marcus had designed through careful placement of his visible cameras. Like mice in a maze, they were heading straight for his prepared killing ground, but it was the third team that concerned him. They were moving differently, more cautiously, led by a figure Marcus recognized from his intelligence files. Colonel James Harper, former Special Forces, now Blackwood's head of operations. If Harper was personally leading the assault, this wasn't just about silencing witnesses anymore. Marcus reached for his secure tablet, initiating a protocol he'd hoped he wouldn't need. Every piece of evidence, the geological surveys, safeguards illegal activities, the surveillance footage, began uploading to multiple secure servers around the world. Even if they took him down, the truth would still come out. Through his thermal imaging, Marcus watched Harper's team setting up what looked like specialized breaching equipment. They were preparing for a long siege, probably assuming he was trapped in his house. That assumption was about to cost them dearly. Marcus opened a hidden panel in his command center, revealing a rack of equipment that hadn't seen use since his active duty days. "All right, Blackwood," he said quietly, checking the charges on his non-lethal defensive weapons. "Let's see how your team handles someone who wrote their playbook." Marcus's first counterstrike came not with violence but with information. As Harper's team set up their breaching equipment, Marcus activated a specialized communication system he'd installed throughout his property. Unlike standard speakers, this used hyperdirectional sound, allowing him to target specific individuals with audio that only they could hear. "Did Blackwood tell you about the radiation, Colonel Harper?" Marcus's voice whispered directly into the team leader's ear, making him flinch visibly on the thermal feed. "About how the mining operation will poison everything within 50 miles. Harper's hand went to his radio, but Marcus was already switching targets, speaking to each team member individually. "Check your dosimeters. The deposits are already leaking. Every minute you spend here increases your exposure. Blackwood knows. Why do you think he's not here himself?" The psychological impact was immediate. Several operators pulled out radiation detection equipment, suddenly uncertain about their mission. Marcus watched as Harper tried to restore order, but the seeds of doubt were planted. "Think about it," Marcus continued, his voice now broadcasting to all of them. "Why would an HOA need military-grade equipment to enforce property codes? Why are you really here? Ask Harper about Operation Burning River, about what happened to the last team that asked too many questions." Through his cameras, Marcus saw Harper grabbing his satellite phone, likely calling Blackwood for instructions. But before any orders could come through, Marcus's backup plan kicked in. The small EMP device he'd hidden near their command vehicle activated, taking out their long-range communications. Now isolated and growing increasingly uncertain, the assault team's professional cohesion began to crack. Marcus had seen it before. Even elite operators could be rattled when they started questioning their mission's legitimacy. But Harper wasn't so easily deterred. While his men hesitated, he pulled out a tablet, displaying something that made them stiffen to attention. Marcus zoomed in his best camera, catching a glimpse of what looked like official federal credentials. Harper was convincing them this was a legitimate government operation. Clever. Marcus muttered. He'd expected this. Blackwood's previous operations had often hidden behind falsified federal authority. Time to change tactics. Marcus activated his property's sprinkler system, but instead of water, the sprinklers released a dense, harmless smoke infused with a chemical marker. To the assault team, it would appear to be simple cover smoke. What they didn't know was that each droplet contained a unique radiological tracer, one that would show up on any future medical screening. "Your call, gentlemen," Marcus broadcast. "Every second you spend in that smoke leaves evidence that can't be erased. When the FBI investigates, and they will investigate, there'll be proof you were here. Harper's badges might be good, but are they good enough to explain away your participation in a domestic black op?" The effect was electric. 3 operators immediately backed away from the smoke. Harper shouted something about federal immunity, but the damage was done. His men were professional enough to know that just following orders wouldn't protect them if this went public. Marcus pressed his advantage, using his directional speakers to create the impression of movement through the smoke. The team responded automatically, shifting formation to track the phantom sounds. But this defensive posture put them exactly where Marcus needed them. With precise timing, Marcus triggered the property's ground-based sensors. The data they gathered wasn't just for surveillance, it fed into a sophisticated terrain mapping system. Every puddle of water, every patch of mud, every loose stone had been catalogued and prepared. Suddenly, the ground beneath the team's feet began to shift. Not dramatically. Marcus wasn't trying to harm them, but enough to disrupt their footing. Water pressure carefully adjusted beneath the surface created patches of unstable mud. Strategic vibrations from buried devices loosened gravel at key points. The effect was subtle but devastating to their tactical positioning. Every time they tried to establish a stable firing position, the ground would shift slightly. Each attempt to set up their breaching equipment was met with terrain that wouldn't quite support the weight. Harper, recognizing the psychological warfare at play, ordered his men to fall back and regroup. But Marcus had one final card to play. As the team retreated, his cameras captured high-resolution images of each operator's face and equipment. Within seconds, an automated system began cross-referencing their identities against military and contractor databases. "I have your names," Marcus announced, his voice now coming from all directions. "Your service records, your contractors, your current assignments. In 30 minutes, everything I know about Safeguard, the radiation, and your involvement goes. In public, unless you make the right choice now." The team froze, caught between Harper's orders and the very real threat to their careers and freedom. Marcus watched through his feeds as the colonel realized he was losing control of the situation. The question now was, would Harper retreat to protect his men or push forward to complete his mission at any cost? Marcus spent the next 2 hours fortifying his position, but not in the way Safeguard would expect. Instead of strengthening his physical defenses, he focused on information security, backing up data, establishing redundant communication lines, and preparing multiple contingency plans. His years in the field had taught him that information was often more valuable than ammunition. His security feeds showed Harper's team had withdrawn to a position just beyond his property line, setting up a loose perimeter. They weren't retreating. They were regrouping, likely waiting for new orders from Blackwood. More concerning were the unmarked vans now parked at strategic points around his neighborhood. Electronic warfare units, judging by the subtle antenna arrays barely visible on their roofs. "Going after my communications, are you?" Marcus muttered, noting their positions. He'd anticipated this, which was why his most critical systems ran on a closed network, with multiple backup power sources and hardened transmission lines buried deep underground. A notification popped up on his secure tablet. Sarah had managed to get the geological survey data to his contact at the DTSA. Mike's response was immediate and alarming. "This goes higher than Safeguard." Just got word from above. We're being told to stand down. Someone's protecting this operation. Marcus was composing a response when his perimeter sensors detected movement at his gate. David Chen, his neighbor who'd received the eminent domain notice, was standing there with his teenage daughter Emily. Their body language screamed distress. Marcus activated his external cameras, zooming in on David's face. The man looked like he'd aged years overnight. "Mr. Reynolds," David called out, "please, we need your help. They're trying to force us out tonight." After careful scanning to ensure they weren't being coerced, Marcus allowed them through the first security gate. He met them in a reinforced receiving area he'd built specifically for situations requiring direct contact with visitors. "They came with papers," David explained, hands shaking as he passed Marcus a stack of documents. "Said we have to vacate immediately due to environmental hazards. They're offering cash if we leave tonight, threatening legal action if we don't. Emily here." He glanced at his daughter, who looked equally terrified. "She's the one who noticed them placing something near our water main." Marcus examined the papers. They appeared official, but he spotted subtle inconsistencies that marked them as forgeries, sophisticated ones, but fake nonetheless. "What did they place near your water main?" "Some kind of device," Emily spoke up, pulling out her phone. "I took pictures before they saw me." She showed Marcus several clear shots of what looked like standard water testing equipment, but Marcus recognized it as something far more sinister, a chemical injection system designed to make water appear contaminated. Their manufacturing evidence, Marcus realized, creating a false environmental crisis to justify immediate eviction. He turned to his security console, pulling up thermal images of the surrounding properties. Similar devices had been placed near several other homes. "Is it true?" David asked quietly. "About the radiation?" Marcus studied the man carefully before responding. "Yes, but not in the way they're claiming. The real threat is what they're planning to do, not what's there now. They want us out before their mining operation begins." "Mining?" Emily's eyes widened. "But this is a residential area." "Not for long," Marcus replied, bringing up the geological surveys on a secure monitor. "These deposits are worth billions, but extracting them would poison the groundwater for decades. They need everyone gone before that becomes public knowledge." David slumped against the wall. "What can we do? We can't fight a mining company." "No," Marcus agreed, "but we can expose them. Those devices they're planting, they're proof of criminal conspiracy. Every false document, every fake test, every illegal eviction, it's all evidence." He turned to Emily. "Those pictures you took are crucial. Would you be willing to help gather more evidence? The trick is to document everything without letting them know we're building a case." Emily straightened, her fear giving way to determination. "What do you need?" Marcus quickly outlined a plan. Emily, being young and tech-savvy, could move through the neighborhood without arousing suspicion, documenting Safeguard's activities under the guise of normal teenage social media use. Meanwhile, David could rally other neighbors, creating a network of observers. "But you both need to understand the risks," Marcus warned. "These people are dangerous. If they realize what we're doing, they're threatening our home." David interrupted, his voice finding new strength. "Our community. We can't just run." Marcus nodded, respect growing for his neighbor's courage. He began copying files to encrypted drives, preparing packets of evidence for each of them to keep secure. "We'll need to work fast," he explained. "Once they realize their intimidation tactics aren't working, they'll escalate." And Blackwood, he's not known for his patience. As if to emphasize his point, the lights in the neighborhood flickered ominously. Safeguard's electronic warfare units were beginning their attack on the area's infrastructure. The real siege was about to begin. The first direct confrontation with Blackwood himself came sooner than Marcus expected. As darkness fell, a sleek black Suburban pulled up to his gate. Unlike Safeguard's tactical teams, Blackwood emerged alone, wearing an expensive suit that seemed out of place among the military-grade equipment surrounding his property. "Mr. Reynolds," Blackwood called out, his voice carrying the practiced smoothness of a corporate negotiator. "I think it's time we had a proper conversation." He held his hands up, showing he was unarmed. "Just you and me. Professional courtesy between two men who understand how this game is played." Marcus watched through his cameras as Blackwood produced a familiar-looking file. "Your service record is impressive. Private military consulting, specialized security operations, high-risk asset protection. We're not so different, you and I. We both understand that sometimes progress requires difficult decisions." "The difference," Marcus responded through his external speakers, "is that I never poisoned communities for profit." Blackwood's smile didn't waver. "Ah, yes, Patricia's little data dump. Tell me, have you actually read through all those geological surveys, the technical specifications, the projected economic impact?" He tapped the file in his hands. "This isn't just about profit, Mr. Reynolds. These minerals are crucial for national security. Battery technology, weapons systems, classified defense projects. America needs these resources." "And the radiation contamination? The destroyed water table? Are those acceptable casualties for your patriotic mission?" "There are always costs to progress," Blackwood replied smoothly, "but we can ensure those costs are properly compensated." He pulled out a document. "I'm authorized to offer you 3 times your property's market value, plus a consulting, in position with Safeguard. Your expertise would be invaluable to our operation." Marcus noticed movement in his peripheral cameras. While Blackwood played the reasonable negotiator, Harper's teams were quietly repositioning, establishing clear fields of fire around his house. "And if I refuse, then unfortunately the environmental hazards we've discovered will require immediate evacuation. Our tests showed dangerous levels of contamination in the groundwater, all properly documented, of course. The EPA takes such threats very seriously. Like the contamination you're manufacturing at David Chen's house," Marcus countered. "The fake testing equipment you're planting throughout the neighborhood." For the first time, Blackwood's composure cracked slightly. His eyes narrowed, calculating this new variable. "The children shouldn't have been taking pictures. That was unfortunate. But they're safe, for now. Whether they stay that way depends on you." Marcus felt his jaw tighten. "Threatening children, Blackwood? That's a line you don't want to cross with me." "No threats, Mr. Reynolds. Just reality. You're a practical man. You understand that once certain processes are set in motion, they develop their own momentum. Accidents happen, papers get lost, people disappear." Blackwood spread his hands. "Or they don't. Your choice." Through his thermal imaging, Marcus could see Harper's teams had completed their encirclement. Blackwood wasn't here to negotiate. This was just theater to keep Marcus distracted while they prepared their real assault. "Let me offer you a different choice," Marcus replied. "I have proof of everything. The fake environmental tests, the illegal surveillance, the radiation risks from your planned mining operation. One phone call sends it all to every major news outlet and federal agency. You think that would stop us?" Blackwood actually laughed. "We have friends in very high places, Mr. Reynolds. Any investigation would be quietly buried. Any reporters would be discredited. The evidence would vanish along with anyone trying to expose it." "Maybe," Marcus conceded. "But I also have something else. Detailed files on your previous operations. South America, Africa. The accidents that befell uncooperative property owners. All that disappeared evidence. I found copies." That hit home. Blackwood's casual stance stiffened almost imperceptibly. "Those records were destroyed. Nothing's ever really destroyed in the digital age. You should know that. So here's my counteroffer. Withdraw your teams, cancel the eviction notices and walk away, or I ensure that every dark secret from your corporate black ops career becomes very, very public. Blackwood studied the gate for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he smiled again, but this time it was cold, predatory. You're assuming you'll have time to make that call. Harper's teams are in position. Your defenses are impressive, but we have something special planned. A decisive solution. He turned to walk away, then paused. One last chance, Mr. Reynolds. Take the offer, because what happens next, well, let's just say sometimes progress requires extreme measures. As Blackwood's Suburban pulled away, Marcus's sensors detected multiple new heat signatures in the tree line. They were setting up something much larger than standard breaching equipment. Whatever their decisive solution was, it was about to begin. Help arrived from an unexpected quarter. As Marcus monitored Safeguard's preparations for their decisive solution, a familiar vehicle pulled up to his gate, but not from the main road. A mud-splattered jeep had navigated the old Forest Service road that ran behind his property, using a route that bypassed Safeguard's perimeter. The driver was a woman in her mid-40s, wearing tactical gear that had seen real use. Marcus recognized her immediately. Commander Rachel Torres, his former teammate from their private military contractor days. She'd left that life to become an environmental protection specialist, though her methods were often as unorthodox as her previous career. Your property's surrounded by some very professional-looking mercenaries. Rachel's voice came through his secure channel. She was still using their old frequencies. Looks like you could use a specialist in corporate malfeasance. Marcus quickly ran his authentication protocols, confirming her identity before allowing her through his secondary gate. Rachel had clearly come prepared. Her jeep was loaded with environmental testing equipment and what looked like serious electronic warfare gear. "Sarah called you?" Marcus asked as Rachel entered his command center, noting how she automatically took up a defensive position with clear sightlines to both exits. "She did. Said you had proof of radiation contamination risks and corporate black ops." Rachel pulled out a tablet, already calling up satellite imagery of the area. "But she didn't mention you were up against Alexander Blackwood. That bastard's been on my watch list for years. You've dealt with him before." Rachel's expression darkened. "Amazon Basin, 2019. His company was using similar tactics, fake environmental hazards to force indigenous communities off their land. By the time we proved the contamination reports were fabricated, 3 villages had been displaced and a river system was poisoned by illegal mining operations." She studied Marcus's security feeds, her experienced eye catching details others might miss. Those aren't standard breaching charges they're setting up. That's industrial mining equipment, shaped charges designed for geological surveys. They're going to try to trigger a controlled underground collapse. Marcus zoomed in his cameras on the equipment Rachel indicated. "Collapse my property to cover their tracks?" "And prove their point about environmental hazards," Rachel nodded. "The vibrations would likely crack your foundation, possibly damage your water well. They'd use that as evidence that the whole area is geologically unstable, fast-track the eviction orders for the entire neighborhood. Can you prove they're using unauthorized mining explosives?" Rachel was already unpacking specialized scanning equipment. "Better than that. Those charges have unique chemical signatures. If we can document them using certified testing protocols." She pulled out what looked like official EPA credentials. "Well, let's just say some of us still believe in protecting communities from corporate predators." Marcus watched as she set up her equipment, noting how she automatically positioned herself away from windows and kept checking her escape routes. "Some habits never died. There's more," he said, showing her the geological surveys from Patricia's files. "The rare earth deposits thereafter. The radiation risk isn't just from the mining operation. These minerals are naturally occurring, nuclear fuel precursors. Rachel's eyes widened as she studied the data. They're not just mining for electronics components. This is weapons-grade material. She pulled out a secure phone. I need to contact some people at the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. This just became a national security issue. Before she could make the call, Marcus's perimeter sensors blared a warning. Safeguards teams were moving into their final positions, and the electronic warfare vans were powering up their equipment. Whatever you're going to do it fast, Marcus warned. They're about to make their move. Rachel quickly set up additional sensors around his property while simultaneously documenting Safeguards' positions. We need to prove they're placing those charges without proper permits or safety protocols. If we can show they're deliberately risking groundwater contamination, they'll bury any investigation, Marcus countered. Blackwood said they have friends in high places. Some places are higher than others, Rachel replied cryptically, sending data through her secure channels. And some of us have spent years building cases against operations like this. Your evidence could be the final piece we need. A deep thrumming filled the air as Safeguards' equipment powered up. They were preparing to detonate their charges, probably thinking the vibrations would disable Marcus's security systems. How long do you need? Marcus asked, already moving to his defensive controls. 10 minutes to document everything, another 5 to transmit to secure servers. Rachel was working with practiced efficiency, her movements precise and professional. After that, it won't matter what they destroy here. The evidence will be beyond their reach. Marcus nodded, activating his property's final defensive protocols. I'll buy you the time. Just remember, they're not the only ones who know how to use mining equipment for unconventional purposes. The true stakes became devastatingly clear as Rachel's specialized equipment began mapping the underground deposits. Her ground-penetrating radar, far more sophisticated than Safeguard's civilian gear, revealed a nightmare scenario beneath their feet. These readings can't be right, Rachel muttered, recalibrating her instruments, but the numbers didn't change. Marcus, the radioactive deposits, they're not just weapons-grade material. They're unstable. The mining operation wouldn't just contaminate the groundwater. It could trigger a chain reaction. Marcus studied the data streaming across her screens. How bad? Think small-scale nuclear incident, not an explosion, but radiation release significant enough to make half the county uninhabitable. She pulled up more detailed scans. That's why they need everyone gone before they start. They're not just trying to avoid lawsuits. They're preparing for a controlled disaster. The revelation hit Marcus like a physical blow. They're planning to sacrifice the entire area. The water facility isn't just cover, it's containment infrastructure. He quickly accessed the construction permits Sarah had uncovered. Look at these specifications. They're not building a water treatment plant, they're building a radiation containment system disguised as one. Rachel nodded grimly. Classic Blackwood. In the Amazon, he turned toxic waste dumps into wildlife preserves. Perfect cover, nobody's allowed in, and any environmental damage can be blamed on natural causes. Before they could discuss further, Marcus's sensors detected new movement. Safeguards teams were placing their charges at precise intervals around his property, but now, understanding their true purpose, the pattern was clear. They weren't trying to collapse his foundation. They were conducting a preliminary geological test. They're mapping the deposit boundaries, Rachel confirmed, watching through the thermal feeds. Those aren't just demolition charges, they're survey explosives. The vibrations will show them exactly where the unstable materials are concentrated. And if some troublesome property owners get their homes damaged in the process, bonus for them. Instant justification for emergency evictions. Rachel's fingers flew over her equipment. We need to document this. If we can prove they knowingly risked triggering a radiation release. Marcus's external cameras suddenly picked up movement at his gate. David Chen was back, But this time he looked different, determined rather than frightened. "Mr. Reynolds," David called out, "you need to see this. The whole neighborhood, they're evacuating everyone. Police, fire department, hazmat teams. They're saying there's been a chemical spill." Marcus quickly brought up local emergency channels on his communications array. Sure enough, Safeguard had manufactured their crisis. Emergency alerts were broadcasting warnings about a toxic spill from an overturned truck, ordering immediate evacuation of the entire area. "Perfect cover," Rachel said quietly. "Once everyone's gone, they can blame any radiation readings on the fictional chemical spill. By the time anyone realizes the truth, the mining operation will be too far along to stop," Marcus finished. He turned to his security feeds, watching as families hurriedly packed cars, emergency vehicles blocked roads, and Safeguard personnel, now dressed as hazmat responders, directed the evacuation. But something about the scene caught his attention. The evacuation routes. They weren't random. Safeguard was herding residents along specific paths, away from certain areas. "Rachel, overlay your radiation maps with the evacuation routes." She quickly compiled the data, and the pattern emerged. The evacuation was deliberately steering people away from the most damning evidence: the fake testing equipment, the survey charges, the electronic warfare vans disguised as emergency vehicles. They're not just evacuating the area, Marcus realized. They're using the chaos to clean up their tracks. Once the residents are gone, they'll find their homes mysteriously damaged by the chemical spill, Rachel finished. Structural problems that make the buildings unsafe to reoccupy. Environmental contamination requiring long-term closure of the area. David, still at the gate, looked devastated. "All our homes, everything we've built here." Marcus made a decision. "David, I need you to do something. Don't evacuate yet. Instead, gather as many neighbors as you can trust. Tell them to document everything. Photos, videos, samples from those water testing devices. Whatever Safeguard is using to fake this crisis, we need proof." "But the chemical spilled is fake," Rachel interjected. "I'm an EPA specialist. Their hazmat procedures are all wrong. Their equipment is military, not civilian. They're counting on panic to keep people from asking questions." Marcus watched, as understanding dawned in David's eyes, followed by anger. The man who'd come to him terrified days ago was gone, replaced by someone ready to fight back. As David hurried off to rally the neighbors, Marcus turned back to his security feeds. Safeguard's teams were getting ready to detonate their survey charges. Soon, they'd have their radiation mapping data, and the next phase of their operation would begin. "How long until your documentation is complete?" he asked Rachel. 5 more minutes." "But Marcus," she hesitated, "if those charges go off in the wrong sequence, or if they miscalculated the deposit boundaries." The unspoken warning hung in the air. They weren't just racing against Safeguard now, they were racing against the possibility of an environmental catastrophe that would make Safeguard's fake chemical spill look trivial in comparison. The discovery that changed everything came from Emily Chen's social media activism. While her father David rallied the adult neighbors, Emily had been documenting the evacuation through her phone, streaming live to multiple platforms. Her teenage eye for detail caught something the adults had missed. The hazmat team's equipment wasn't just wrong, it was theatrical. "Look at this," she said, sending footage to Marcus's secure server. The video showed Safeguard's fake hazmat teams setting up their containment gear. To the average person, it looked impressive and official. But Rachel immediately spotted the flaw. "Those are movie props," she said incredulously. "High-end ones, but definitely props. Look at the serial numbers on the equipment. They're from a production supply company that specializes in government and military scenes." Marcus quickly ran the numbers through his database. "Peninsula Production Services," he confirmed. "They provide theatrical equipment for Hollywood films. Blackwood's people didn't just fake an evacuation, they literally staged it. Rachel was already documenting everything. This is perfect. Using counterfeit emergency equipment is a federal offense. Even if they bury the environmental evidence, this is fraud on a massive scale. Suddenly, Marcus's perimeter sensors detected new movement. The electronic warfare vans were powering up, but something about their energy signature was different. Rachel's equipment started screaming warnings. Those aren't just signal jammers, she realized, checking her readings. They're generating specific interference patterns. Marcus, they're trying to mask radiation signatures. Marcus quickly accessed his deep ground sensors. The survey charges they planted, they're not just for mapping. They're going to trigger a small release, just enough to make their fake evacuation real. My God, Rachel breathed. Create an actual emergency to cover up preparation for a bigger one. If there's genuine radiation detected, no one will question the evacuation or investigate too closely. Through his cameras, Marcus watched as Harper's teams began their final preparations. They were setting up what looked like scientific monitoring equipment, real this time, not movie props. They were getting ready to document the radiation release they were about to trigger, but Emily's live stream had caught something else. In the background of her video, barely visible, was a familiar silver Mercedes. Patricia Morrison was back, and she was arguing with someone in a safeguard uniform. Marcus enhanced the audio from his nearest directional microphone, catching fragments of the conversation. Not what I agreed to. Can't risk actual contamination. Children live here. She didn't know, Rachel said quietly. She thought it was all just legal pressure and fake evidence. Finding out they're planning to actually irradiate the area. Before they could process this new development, Marcus's deep ground sensors registered the first detonation sequence beginning. The charges were firing in sequence, sending precisely calculated shockwaves through the underlying rock strata. They're fracturing the deposit chamber, Rachel said, watching her instruments, creating controlled fissures to release just enough radiation to trigger emergency sensors, but not enough for a full-scale incident. Yet. Marcus quickly accessed his property's subsurface defensive grid, a network of stabilization rods and pressure sensors he'd installed to protect against exactly this kind of underground attack. But as he checked the readings, he realized something terrible. The deposits aren't where their surveys showed, he said, watching the real-time data. The instability pattern is different. If those charges continue in this sequence, Rachel saw it too, they'll trigger a cascade failure. The entire deposit could destabilize at once. She grabbed her secure phone. I'm calling in an emergency response team. There's no time, Marcus said, his fingers flying over his controls. By the time they get here, wait. He pulled up the construction specs for Safeguard's fake water treatment facility. Look at this, the containment systems they built to handle future radiation. They're already operational. You want to use their own containment infrastructure against them? Marcus, that's incredibly risky. One wrong calculation. Better than letting them trigger a radiation release they can't control. He was already accessing the facility's control systems. Child's play for someone with his background. Their own safety protocols will force them to stop the detonation sequence. Through his cameras, Marcus could see the chaos beginning. Safeguard's fake hazmat teams were picking up real radiation warnings. Harper's men were starting to realize something was wrong. And in the middle of it all, Patricia Morrison was walking purposefully toward the nearest survey charge, a determined look on her face. What is she doing? Rachel asked, watching the feed. Marcus zoomed in his camera, catching the glint of metal in Patricia's hand. She's carrying wire cutters. She's going to try to stop the detonation sequence manually. The question now was, could they prevent a radiation release without exposing the entire neighborhood to the very danger Safeguard had been planning to exploit? And would Patricia's last-minute attack of conscience help or make things catastrophically worse. Erose, and now partially destabilized by Safeguard's failed attempt to exploit them. While Marcus worked to hijack Safeguard's containment systems and Rachel coordinated with her EPA contacts, an unexpected alliance was forming in the neighborhood. David Chen hadn't just gathered a few concerned neighbors. He'd mobilized an entire community response team. Years of HOA harassment had created an underground network of homeowners who were tired of being bullied. Through his security feeds, Marcus watched as residents strategically positioned themselves throughout the neighborhood. Some were openly documenting Safeguard's activities with phones and cameras, while others quietly collected soil and water samples from around the fake testing equipment. Each piece of evidence was immediately uploaded to secure cloud storage. That Emily had helped set up. Your neighbors are surprisingly well organized, Rachel noted, watching the coordination. Living under Patricia's HOA regime taught them to work together, Marcus replied, though I doubt she expected it to be used. Against her corporate masters, an alert flashed on his tactical display. Patricia had reached the first survey charge, but Harper's team had spotted her. They were moving to intercept, their weapons now openly displayed. She'll never reach the detonator in time, Rachel said, checking the countdown on her instruments. The sequence is already in motion. Marcus made a quick decision. Keep working on the containment systems. I'm going to give Patricia some cover. He activated his property's external defense grid, but not in the way Safeguard would expect. Instead of targeting their teams directly, he used his sound systems and lighting arrays to create chaos and confusion in their perimeter. Powerful spotlights suddenly swept the area, their beams reflecting off strategically placed mirrors to create disorienting patterns. The hyperdirectional speakers began broadcasting a carefully crafted audio mix, overlapping radio communications, false orders, and the sounds of approaching vehicles. The effect was immediate. Harper's teams instinctively responded to the apparent threats, breaking their formation to address multiple phantom challenges. In the confusion, Patricia reached the first detonator, but Marcus's cameras caught something the others had missed. Blackwood had emerged from his command vehicle, and he was walking purposefully toward Patricia. The look on his face made Marcus's blood run cold. Rachel, we've got a problem. Blackwood's not trying to stop Patricia from cutting the wires. He wants her to do it. Rachel's eyes widened as she checked her instruments. The detonation sequence, it's not what we thought. They built in a failsafe. If the sequence is interrupted wrong, it triggers an immediate detonation, Marcus finished. They're going to make Patricia their scapegoat. When the radiation releases, they'll blame it on her interference. Marcus quickly accessed his external speakers. Patricia, stop! The wires are trapped. They want you to cut them. But the chaos he'd created with his defense systems worked against him now. His warning was lost in the cacophony of false signals and disrupted communications. Patricia raised the wire cutters, her hands shaking but determined. New plan, Marcus said, his fingers flying over his controls. Rachel, forget the containment systems. Focus on documenting everything. I'm going to try something dangerous. Before Rachel could respond, Marcus activated his property's deep ground stabilization system, not to prevent the detonations, but to redirect them. The reinforcement rods he'd installed weren't just passive protection, they were part of a dynamic response network. What are you doing? Rachel asked, watching as his system came online. Creating a controlled collapse. Marcus was working faster, now making split-second calculations. If I can't stop the sequence, I can change where the energy goes. Instead of fracturing the deposits, we channel the force away from them. Through his cameras, he watched as Patricia finally cut the wires. Blackwood's smile of triumph turned to confusion as the expected catastrophe didn't immediately materialize. The detonations were still happening, but Marcus's system was altering their effect, turning the ground itself into a massive shock absorber. But he knew it wouldn't hold for long. Already his sensors were showing dangerous stress patterns forming in the underlying rock strata. He had minutes, maybe seconds, before something gave way. "The containment facility," he said suddenly. "Rachel, what if we turned it into a sink? Use their own infrastructure to absorb the radiation they're trying to release." "That's actually brilliant," Rachel replied, quickly adjusting her equipment. "Their system is already designed to handle radiation, if we can channel everything." And there, Marcus's tactical display lit up with new warnings. Harper's teams had realized something was wrong. They were pulling back, abandoning their equipment and racing for their vehicles. In their haste to escape, they left behind something crucial: their operational plans and equipment documentation. Emily's live stream caught it all: the hasty retreat, the abandoned equipment, and most importantly, Blackwood's face as he realized. His carefully orchestrated disaster was being turned against him, but they weren't safe yet. Marcus's sensors showed the ground becoming increasingly unstable. They'd prevented the immediate catastrophe, but the underlying problem remained. The radioactive deposits were still there, still dangerous, and now partially destabilized by Safeguard's failed attempt to exploit them. Marcus launched his first major offensive not with weapons, but with information. As Safeguard's teams retreated in disarray, he activated a system he'd prepared for exactly this moment. A massive data dump to every major news outlet, federal agency, and environmental watchdog group in the country. Emily's live stream was just the beginning, he told Rachel as they worked. Every surveillance feed, every radiation reading, every piece of evidence we've collected. It's all going public right now. Too many sources for them to suppress, too many witnesses for them to discredit. But Blackwood had one more card to play. As Marcus's data bomb detonated across the internet, Safeguard's electronic warfare vans suddenly switched frequencies. Instead of trying to jam communications, they began broadcasting their own signal, a sophisticated digital forgery showing Marcus's property as the source of the radiation threat. "They're trying to flip the narrative," Rachel said, watching the false data stream across her monitors. "Make it look like your security systems caused the instability. They'll claim they were here to prevent a disaster, not cause one." Marcus allowed himself a grim smile. "Except I anticipated that too." He pulled up a hidden file on his system. "Remember those XR7 mapping devices they planted? I didn't just document them, I reprogrammed them. For the past 12 hours, they've been gathering evidence against their own owners." Through his cameras, he could see Blackwood frantically talking on his phone, likely trying to contain the expanding crisis. But it was too late. The XR7 devices had mapped everything: the survey charges, the fake hazmat equipment, even the radiation-shielded cases in Safeguard's vehicles that contained their real testing gear. Patricia, still standing by the deactivated detonator, suddenly found herself surrounded by her former neighbors. But instead of the anger she expected, she saw something else in their faces: determination. The community she'd tried to control had united against a greater threat. "Mrs. Morrison," David Chen called out, his phone still recording everything. "I think it's time you told us exactly what Safeguard promised you. All of it." Patricia looked from David to the retreating Safeguard teams, then to Marcus's cameras. Her shoulders straightened as she made her decision. "You'll want to record this," she said, pulling out her own phone. "I kept copies of every meeting, every promise, every threat, including the ones they didn't know about." But even as Patricia began her confession, Marcus's deep ground sensors detected a new problem. The radioactive deposits, partially destabilized by Safeguard's aborted operation, were showing increasing signs of activity. The danger wasn't over. It was evolving. "Rachel," he called out, "look at these readings. The containment facility can't handle this level of radiation long-term. We've delayed the crisis, but we haven't solved it." Rachel studied the data, her expression grave. "No, but we've done something else. we've proven Safeguard knew about the danger and tried to exploit it anyway. That changes everything legally. She was right. Already, Marcus's security feeds were picking up new vehicles approaching, but these weren't Safeguard's black SUVs. Federal agency logos were clearly visible on the incoming convoy. Your evidence dump worked, Rachel said. EPA, Nuclear Regulatory. Commission FBI, they're all responding. Even Blackwood's friends in high places can't stop this now. Marcus watched as Blackwood's composure finally cracked. The Safeguard CEO was now frantically ordering his remaining teams to destroy evidence. But he had waited too late. The community's documentation was already backed up and distributed, and the federal response teams were minutes away. Harper made one last attempt to salvage the situation, ordering his men to secure the area for public safety. But the Neighborhood Watch Network, coordinated through Emily's impromptu social media command center, had effectively surrounded Safeguard's positions with witnesses and cameras. "It's over," Marcus said into his external speakers, his voice carrying across the chaos. "Your own equipment has documented everything, Blackwood. The radiation risk, the fake evacuation, the attempted cover-up. Leave now or stay and face federal investigators. Your choice." But as Blackwood and his teams made their final retreat, Marcus knew the real work was just beginning. The radioactive deposits were still a threat. The community's homes were still in danger, and somewhere in the confusion, Colonel Harper had disappeared with a hard drive full of sensitive data. Rachel seemed to read his thoughts. "This isn't the end, is it?" "No," Marcus replied, already planning his next moves. "This was just their first attempt. Once Blackwood regroups, once he realizes what's really at stake here, he let the thought hang unfinished as federal vehicles began arriving in force. The immediate battle was won, but the war for the community's future was far from over. And somewhere in the darkness, Harper was undoubtedly planning his countermove. The federal response turned Marcus's quiet neighborhood into a scene from a disaster movie. Hazmat teams in genuine protective gear swept the area with real radiation detectors. FBI agents documented abandoned Safeguard equipment. EPA specialists gathered soil samples around the fake testing devices. But it was the Nuclear Regulatory Commission's team that confirmed Marcus's worst fears. Their specialized equipment detected what Safeguard had missed in their surveys. The radioactive deposits weren't just unstable, they were shifting. The failed detonation sequence had created unpredictable underground pressure patterns. "Your containment solution bought us time," the NRC team leader told Marcus. "But we're looking at a serious geological problem. Those deposits need to be stabilized permanently, or this whole area could become an exclusion zone." Marcus watched through his cameras as military-grade radiation sensors were deployed throughout the neighborhood. The readings were sobering. While current levels were safe, the underlying threat was growing. Safeguard's reckless attempt to trigger a controlled release had compromised the natural barriers containing the deposits. Rachel, working alongside the EPA teams, made another discovery. "The water table is already showing trace contamination," she reported. "Not enough to be dangerous yet, but it's spreading. Blackwood's operation didn't just fail, it cracked something open down there." Marcus was about to respond when his perimeter sensors caught something unusual. A drone, much smaller and more sophisticated than Safeguard's previous models, was conducting high-altitude surveillance of the federal operation. Its flight pattern was military-grade, designed to avoid standard detection. "Harper," Marcus muttered, recognizing the tactical approach. The colonel hadn't retreated with Blackwood. He was gathering intelligence, probably planning a counterstrike. Then Marcus's secure phone buzzed with an encrypted message from Sarah. "Emergency filing at federal court. Safeguard's parent company. Just submitted paperwork claiming ownership of the containment facility. They're trying to block federal access." "Of course they are," Rachel said when Marcus showed her the message. "The facility contains evidence of their real plan. if they can delay the investigation long enough to clean it out. But Marcus was already ahead of them. While Safeguard had been retreating, he'd used their own mapping equipment to document everything. The XR7 devices hadn't just gathered surface data, they'd created detailed 3D models of the entire facility, including areas Safeguard had tried to keep hidden. "Look at this," he said, pulling up the scans on his security monitors. "The containment system isn't just for radiation. They built in chemical processing capabilities, mineral extraction equipment. This wasn't going to be a treatment plant. It was going to be a covert mining operation disguised as an environmental cleanup site." The FBI agents examining the scans immediately recognized the implications. They were planning to extract the radioactive materials under the cover of environmental remediation, one agent said, "probably ship it out in lead-lined trucks marked as toxic waste removal." Marcus's cameras caught more movement. Patricia Morrison was working with federal investigators, providing detailed testimony about Safeguard's operation. But something in her body language caught his attention. She kept glancing at her phone, her expression growing increasingly worried. Using his directional microphones, Marcus picked up fragments of her conversation. "Threatened my daughter. Said they had people at her campus. Please, you have to—" "Rachel," Marcus called. "Out, we need to check on Patricia's daughter in Boston. Harper's the type to leave insurance policies in place." Rachel was already on her secure line, coordinating with local law enforcement. But before she could confirm the daughter's safety, Marcus's deep ground sensors detected new vibrations. The pressure patterns in the radioactive deposits were changing again, responding to something. "They're not done," Marcus realized, studying the data. "Those charges we stopped, they weren't the only ones. Harper must have placed backup devices. Deeper underground." The federal teams scrambled to respond, but Marcus knew they were facing a race against time. Somewhere out there, Harper was watching, waiting for the right moment to trigger his contingency plan. And this time, he'd made sure the detonations couldn't be redirected or contained. The FBI began evacuating non-essential personnel, but Marcus noticed they were using very specific routes, almost as if they were being herded. He quickly pulled up thermal imaging of the entire area. "Stop!" he shouted over the emergency channel. "The evacuation routes. They're funneling everyone toward pre-positioned radiation hotspots. They're trying to force a mandatory evacuation order." The realization hit hard. Even with federal investigators on site, even with their primary plan exposed, Safeguard was still executing their strategy. They didn't need to hide their operation anymore. They just needed to make the area officially uninhabitable. Once that happened, their shell companies could swoop in and buy the contaminated land for pennies on the dollar. Marcus's legal counterattack came from an unexpected angle. While Safeguard's lawyers tied up federal authorities with injunctions and property claims, he unleashed his own legal weapon, a class action lawsuit filed on behalf of every homeowner in the neighborhood, citing the racketeer-influenced and corrupt organizations, RICO Act, their shell companies, the fake environmental testing, the fraudulent HOA regulations. "It's all part of an organized criminal enterprise," Marcus explained to the FBI's lead investigator. "And thanks to Patricia's recordings, we can prove they used interstate commerce and communications to further their scheme." The RICO filing hit Safeguard where it hurt most, their corporate shield. Suddenly, Blackwood's carefully constructed network of shell companies became a liability, each connection providing new evidence of conspiracy. Every fake environmental test, every fraudulent document, every illegal surveillance device became proof of an ongoing criminal enterprise. But Marcus knew legal maneuvers wouldn't stop Harper's backup explosives. His deep ground sensors were showing increasingly dangerous pressure patterns in the radioactive deposits. They needed a way to neutralize the charges without triggering them. Rachel, working with the NRC team, proposed a solution. We can't disarm the charges directly, but we can change the geological conditions around them. If we inject a specially formulated cement mixture into the surrounding rock strata, we can create a containment shell, Marcus finished, studying the proposal. Force the pressure to dissipate harmlessly instead of fracturing the deposits. The FBI's tactical team, however, had spotted a problem. Harper's drone is still up there, their leader reported. He's watching everything. The moment we start drilling injection wells, he'll trigger those charges. Marcus pulled up his property's 3D mapping system, an idea forming. Maybe that's exactly what we want him to do. He highlighted a specific pattern of underground features. Look at these natural fault lines. If we drill our wells here, here, and here, we create a pattern that looks like we're trying to block his charges, Rachel caught on immediately. So, he triggers them thinking he's stopping us, but actually detonates them exactly where we want, Marcus nodded. The explosion's force will drive our cement mixture into the perfect position, creating an even stronger containment barrier than if we pumped it in manually. The FBI team looked skeptical, but the NRC experts confirmed the physics. It was risky, but it could work. They began preparing the cement mixture while federal agents quietly evacuated nearby homes, this time using routes that had been thoroughly checked for radiation. Marcus watched through his cameras as Emily coordinated the neighborhood's response through her social media network. Residents were documenting everything, creating an unbreakable chain of evidence. If anything went wrong, if Safeguard tried to spin this, there would be hundreds of witnesses with recordings. Suddenly, his perimeter sensors detected movement at the edge of his property. A figure was approaching through the trees, using professional tactical movement. Marcus zoomed in his cameras, expecting to see one of Harper's men. Instead, he recognized the intruder. It was Thomas Rivera, one of Safeguard's senior technicians. But something was different. The man was carrying a laptop and looked terrified. "Mr. Reynolds," Rivera called out, hands raised to show he wasn't armed. "I have something you need to see, something Harper doesn't know I copied." After careful scanning to ensure he wasn't carrying any devices, Marcus allowed Rivera into his security room. The technician quickly pulled up files on his laptop, detailed technical specifications for Safeguard's entire operation. "There. Not just after the radioactive materials," Rivera explained, hands shaking slightly. "The deposits here, they're unique. The specific isotope combination, it's perfect for certain types of classified weapons research. Blackwood has buyers lined up. Foreign governments, private military contractors." Marcus studied the data. His suspicions confirmed. That's why they needed the containment facility, not to prevent contamination, but to process and ship the materials without detection. "There's more," Rivera continued. "Harper's backup charges, they're not just explosives. They're designed to trigger a specific type of reaction in the deposits. If they detonate correctly, the radiation release won't just contaminate the area, it'll make the remaining materials easier to extract and process." Rachel swore quietly as she reviewed the technical specifications. "They're trying to create a controlled nuclear reaction. Use the explosion to pre-process the raw materials. That's insane. The risk of it going wrong—" "Harper doesn't care about the risk," Marcus said grimly. "He just needs it to work long enough for them to extract what they want. After that, any additional contamination would just help cover their tracks." But Rivera's information changed their containment strategy's calculations. The cement mixture they'd prepared wouldn't be strong enough to contain a nuclear reaction. They needed something more sophisticated, something that could handle both the explosion and the subsequent radioactive processes. Marcus turned to his security monitors, watching Harper's drone continue its surveillance pattern. They had the evidence they needed now. Safeguard's entire operation exposed, their true intentions revealed. But stopping Harper's backup plan had just become far more complicated. They weren't just trying to prevent an explosion anymore. They were racing to stop what amounted to an illegal nuclear weapons program hidden in an American suburb. The final assault began with a digital twist. While federal teams scrambled to revise their containment strategy, Harper launched a sophisticated cyber attack on Marcus's security systems. But instead of trying to disable them, he did something far more subtle. He attempted to hijack them. He's not trying to shut us down, Marcus realized, watching the attack patterns. He's trying to use my own equipment to trigger the backup charges. Through his cameras, he could see Harper's drone had been joined by two others, creating a triangulated control network that could maintain command even if one link was broken. Rachel and Rivera worked frantically with the NRC team to modify their containment strategy. The cement mixture was being enhanced with boron compounds and other radiation-absorbing materials, but they needed time to get it ready. Time Harper wasn't going to give them. Multiple intrusion attempts on the main security grid, Marcus announced, his fingers flying over his keyboards. They're probing for... Wait. He studied the attack pattern more closely. This isn't Harper's style. This is too aggressive, too obvious. It's a distraction, Rachel said suddenly. Look at the thermal imaging of the containment facility. Marcus switched feeds and saw it immediately. While Harper's cyber attack drew their attention, a small team had entered the facility through a maintenance tunnel. They were carrying something, equipment cases that gave off a distinctive thermal signature. Those are radiation-shielded containers. Rivera identified them immediately. Special transport cases designed for handling processed nuclear material. They're not trying to trigger the charges yet. They're setting up collection equipment. They want to capture the processed materials immediately after the detonation. Marcus's mind raced through the implications. They're not just creating a weapons-grade incident. They're turning my entire property into a makeshift nuclear processing facility. The explosion would be just the first step. Before they could respond, Marcus's deep-ground sensors detected new vibrations. Harper's team had started activating the backup charges, but not all at once. They were creating a precise sequence of small detonations, slowly building pressure in the deposit chamber. Clever bastard, Marcus muttered. He's not trying to crack it open anymore. He's using the charges to start the refinement process early. Each explosion changes the isotope ratios slightly, making the final extraction easier, Rachel finished, but also making it impossible to stop once it starts. The pressure has to be released somewhere. The FBI tactical team wanted to move in immediately, but Marcus held them back. That's exactly what Harper wants. The moment federal agents breach the facility, he'll claim it was their intervention that caused any radiation release. Safeguard's lawyers would tie this up in court. For years, instead, Marcus initiated a plan he'd been holding in reserve. Every security camera, every sensor, every piece of monitoring equipment on his property began uploading their data directly to a network of international environmental watchdog organizations. If Harper succeeded in triggering a release, the whole world would know exactly who was responsible. But Harper had anticipated this too. The drone network suddenly shifted configuration, creating a sophisticated electronic warfare grid that began targeting Marcus's transmission frequencies. One by one, his external communications were cut off. That's when Emily's social media network proved its worth. As Safeguard's electronic warfare shut down official channels, hundreds of residents began streaming everything through their phones, using dozens of different apps and platforms. It was impossible to block them all. The containment mixture is ready, Rachel reported, but we need at least 15 minutes to get it into position. Marcus checked his sensors. Based on the pressure readings, they had maybe 5 minutes before. Harper's sequential detonations reached critical levels. They needed a way to slow him down without letting him know they were buying time. That's when Marcus noticed something in Rivera's technical specifications, a detail about Safeguard's transport containers. The shielding, he said. It's designed for a specific type of radiation. If the isotope mix is wrong, Rivera caught on immediately. The containers would be useless. They'd have to abort the collection or risk exposing their entire team. Marcus quickly accessed his property's deep ground sensor network, but not to monitor the charges. Instead, he began using the sensors to emit specific frequencies that would interact with the radioactive deposits in unexpected ways. "I'm changing the isotope decay patterns," he explained. "Not enough to cause a release, but enough to make their measurements read wrong. Their equipment will show the process failing." Through his cameras, Marcus watched as Harper's team in haste. The containment facility began reacting to their instruments. Their carefully planned collection sequence was suddenly showing impossible readings. They couldn't risk processing material with the wrong isotope ratios. The results would be both useless and potentially catastrophic. But Harper wasn't done yet. If he couldn't collect the processed materials, he could still trigger a release that would force evacuations and property seizures. The sequential detonations continued, building pressure in the deposit chamber. Now it was a race. Could Rachel's team get the enhanced containment mixture in place before Harper's charges reached critical mass? The hidden agenda behind everything emerged in a moment of crisis. As Harper's sequential detonations continued and Rachel's team raced to deploy the enhanced containment mixture, Marcus's deep ground sensors detected something that changed everything. A third layer of explosives, hidden so deep that even Safeguard's own surveys had missed them. "These aren't Harper's," Rivera said, studying the data. "Look at the placement pattern. These charges were planted months ago, before Safeguard even showed up." He pulled up more technical specifications on his laptop. "The geological surveys, they're not complete. Someone deliberately removed data about the lowest rock strata." Marcus quickly cross-referenced the information with his own databases. "The charges are military grade, but they're an older model. Someone wanted this place rigged for demolition long before Blackwood got involved." Rachel's face went pale as she checked her own readings. "The radiation deposits, they're not natural. The isotope patterns are too precise. This wasn't some random geological formation. Someone engineered this entire situation." Before they could process this revelation, Marcus's security feeds caught movement at the containment facility. A new group had arrived, but these weren't Safeguard operators. Their equipment and tactics were pure military, specifically the kind used by specialized nuclear response units. Delta Force, Marcus identified them, but they're not responding to our situation. They knew exactly where to go. He zoomed in his cameras on their commander, and the final piece clicked into place. "That's Colonel James Wright. He's not just Special Forces, he's part of a classified nuclear materials task force." Rivera's hands shook as he pulled up more files. "There's something else. These transport containers, they're not just for collecting processed materials. They're designed to remove evidence. The whole Safeguard operation, it was a cover-up for something much older." Through his cameras, Marcus watched as Colonel Wright's team efficiently secured the facility. They weren't trying to stop Harper's detonations. They were waiting for them, using the chaos as cover for their own operation. "This whole area," Marcus said slowly, "it was a black site. Some kind of secret nuclear research facility, probably from the Cold War. The residential development, the HOA, even Safeguard's mining operation. It was all built on top of something they wanted to keep buried. But why trigger a crisis now?" Rachel asked. "Because they couldn't keep it contained anymore," Marcus realized. The radiation was starting to leak naturally. They needed a way to remove everything without raising suspicions, so they created Safeguard, manufactured a fake environmental crisis, and used Blackwood's greed and Harper's tactics as cover for their real cleanup operation. Rivera finished. "If anyone started asking questions about radiation, they could blame it on the mining attempt." Marcus's sensors suddenly registered a critical shift in the underground pressure patterns. Harper's sequential detonations were having an unintended effect. They were starting to destabilize the old facility's containment systems. Wright's team, they're not just here to remove evidence, Marcus said, watching their movements. They're trying to prevent a real catastrophe, one that would expose decades of secret nuclear research under an American suburb. But Harper didn't know any of this. His detonations were following a pattern designed for mineral extraction, not for dealing with an unstable research facility. Each blast was pushing them closer to a crisis that even Wright's specialized team couldn't contain. Through his cameras, Marcus saw Emily's social media network was still documenting everything. Hundreds of residents were live-streaming the military's arrival, creating a record that couldn't be erased. The government's decades-old secret was about to become very public. "We have to stop those detonations," Rachel said urgently. "The containment mixture won't work on a facility this complex. We need to let Wright's team take control," Marcus interrupted. "They're the only ones equipped to handle this level of contamination. But first, we have to deal with Harper." Marcus quickly accessed his property's most sophisticated defense systems, not the obvious security measures, but hidden protocols he'd designed for exactly this kind of situation. Within seconds, he'd gained control of Harper's drone network, using their own electronic warfare grid against them. "Harper's team is about to lose their eyes in the sky," he announced. "When that happens, Wright's people can move in and shut down the detonation sequence. But we have to time this perfectly. If Harper realizes he's being outmaneuvered, he might trigger everything at once," Rivera warned. "And with those old research facilities down there, the reaction would be—" He didn't need to finish. They all knew what would happen if Harper's modern explosives triggered a chain reaction in decades-old nuclear research equipment. The question now was, could they stop both Harper's operation and prevent Wright's team from burying the truth about what lay beneath their neighborhood? The final confrontation unfolded in layers of deception and revelation. As Marcus used his hijacked drone network to blind Harper's team, Colonel Wright's forces moved with practiced efficiency to secure the detonation controls. But Harper had one last surprise, a dead man switch that would trigger everything if his team lost contact. "You don't understand what you're interrupting," Harper's voice crackled over the compromised radio network. "This isn't about safeguard anymore. There are things down there that need to stay buried." Marcus watched through his cameras as Wright's team surrounded the containment facility. "We know about the research facility," he broadcast back. "We know this whole development was built to hide it. But triggering a radiation release won't keep your secrets. It'll expose everything." The pressure readings from the deep ground sensors were becoming critical. Decades of hidden nuclear research had left the underlying rock unstable in ways none of their models had predicted. Harper's sequential detonations had started a chain reaction that even Wright's specialized team might not be able to contain. That's when Emily's social media network captured something crucial. One of her teenage friends, live-streaming from the edge of the evacuation zone, caught footage of Blackwood arriving in a helicopter. But he wasn't running away. He was carrying something. Something in a specialized case that matched Rivera's technical specifications. "He's got the original research data." Rivera recognized the container. "Everything about what they were really doing down there. That's his real insurance policy." Marcus made a split-second decision. He transferred control of his security systems to Rachel, then accessed his property's most hidden defense, a network of underground access tunnels he'd discovered during his initial renovation, but had never reported. "Keep Harper's team occupied," he told Rachel. "I'm going after Blackwood. Whatever's in that case is the key to all of this." As Marcus moved through his hidden tunnels, the situation above ground reached its climax. Harper's team, realizing They were surrounded, tried to force their way out of the containment facility, but Wright's forces were ready. The resulting firefight was brief but intense, captured in real time by hundreds of phones and cameras. Marcus emerged from his tunnel, network behind Blackwood's position. The Safeguard CEO was frantically trying to open his secure case, likely planning to destroy its contents. But before he could, Marcus's voice cut through the chaos. "Those documents aren't just about the old facility, are they?" Marcus said, making Blackwood freeze. "They're about what's still active down there, what's still running after all these years." Blackwood's composure cracked. "You don't understand. The research, it never stopped. Safeguard wasn't here to extract materials. We were here to restart the program. The radiation release would have powered up systems that have been dormant for decades." Through his earpiece, Marcus heard Rachel's voice. "The pressure readings. They're not from natural deposits. They're from some kind of reactor, aren't they? Still running on minimal power after all this time." "A new kind of power generation," Blackwood admitted. "Clean, endless energy. But the initial tests, there, were accidents. They couldn't shut it down, couldn't dismantle it. So they buried it, built a community on top to hide it. We were supposed to find a way to safely restart it." Suddenly, Harper's voice broke through the radio channels. "Sir, the containment readings. The old system is waking up. The detonations. They triggered something. It's starting to power up on its own." Marcus watched as Wright's team immediately shifted priorities, moving from containment to evacuation. They knew what was down there, knew what would happen if a decades-old experimental reactor suddenly reactivated. But Marcus had one more card to play. "Rachel," he called over his secure channel, "remember those deep-ground stabilization rods I installed? They weren't just for stopping mining operations. Activate Protocol Omega." Rachel's fingers flew over the controls. Suddenly, Marcus's entire property came alive with hidden technology. The stabilization network wasn't just passive protection. It was a sophisticated power absorption system designed to safely channel and contain exactly this kind of energy. "You built a containment grid," Blackwood realized, watching as Marcus's system began drawing off power from the awakening reactor. "All this time, you knew what was down there." "I suspected," Marcus corrected him. "When I bought this property, I found traces of the old facility. Didn't know exactly what it was, but I knew it needed to be contained. So I prepared for everything." The next hours were a blur of activity. Wright's team secured the old facility. Harper's forces surrendered. Blackwood's case of documents provided the evidence needed to finally expose decades of secret research. The neighborhood, instead of being evacuated, became the center of a new kind of energy research facility, this time with full public oversight and proper safety protocols. And the HOA? Well, under new leadership and with federal supervision, it actually became what it was supposed to be. A genuine community organization focused on protecting residents' interests, not hiding government secrets. Marcus stayed in his house, continuing to maintain his security systems. But now they served a different purpose, helping monitor and protect the revolutionary clean energy technology buried beneath their feet, ensuring it would be used safely and transparently for the benefit of all. As for Patricia Morrison, she found a new calling as a community advocate, working to help other neighborhoods identify and expose corporate exploitation. Sometimes the best way to make amends for past mistakes is to prevent them from happening to others. The spike strips that started it all? They're now displayed in the local museum, along with the full story of how an HOA's attempt to control one homeowner led to the exposure of America's biggest energy secret, and ultimately to a better future for everyone. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.